A quiet welcome to PlotFall. Tonight, our story takes us deep into the quiet, often misunderstood world of the weird sleep habits of the medieval peasants. It's a journey to an era where the night was truly dark and human rhythms were intertwined with the natural world in ways we can barely imagine today. Before we begin, if you find value in these quiet journeys into history, perhaps take a moment to like this video and subscribe. It genuinely helps others discover our growing community. You can also let me know in the comments where you're listening from. It's always fascinating to see our quiet community grow around the world. Now, find a comfortable position, dim the lights, or maybe turn on a soft fan for background noise, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Imagine, if you will, not just a single dwelling, but an entire village nestled deep within the vast, dim stretches of medieval Europe. These homes, simple yet enduring, cluster together like quiet sentinels under a sky that has seen centuries pass. As the sun, glowing like a fading ember, slips beneath the horizon, it leaves behind a final wash of crimson and gold, soft and fleeting, a momentary warmth before the inevitable cool of night. With that descent, the village exhales. The familiar chorus of the day, the distant lowing of cattle, the occasional call of a vendor, the steady clang of the blacksmith's forge, slowly gives way to stillness. One by one, sounds drift away, swallowed by the growing hush. There are no lamps lining the paths, no soft electric hum in the air, no flicker of screens to cast artificial comfort. Darkness arrives not as a convenience to be held at bay, but as a presence to be accepted, whole, enveloping, and final. It wraps itself around rooftops and winding roads, not in menace, but in quiet insistence. This night is complete, profound, and unquestionable. And within its embrace lies the first unspoken rhythm of life in such a world. When the light withdraws, so too must the body. Sleep does not come by schedule but by surrender, a natural, almost reverent response to the great, enveloping silence of the land. In the absence of noise and glare, rest becomes not just necessity, but ritual. For the medieval peasant, the modern notion of an unbroken 8-hour stretch of nightly rest, something we pursue with schedules, supplements, and sleep hygiene, would have seemed entirely alien. Sleep in their world was not a single, seamless event, but a layered, almost ritualistic experience, shaped not by clocks or alarms, but by the natural rhythm of nightfall and the complete absence of artificial light. Their rest was guided by darkness itself, a force that gently divided the night into two distinct phases, known to them as the first sleep and the second sleep. This wasn't mere interruption. It was a pattern, understood and embraced as part of the human condition. As true night settled in, often between what we would now call 9 and 10 o'clock, daily life began to slow, then dissolve. Families would retreat indoors, not to separate bedrooms or softly lit hallways, but to a single, multipurpose room, one that served as kitchen, hearth, and sleeping quarters all at once. There was no grand ceremony to this moment, just the quiet acceptance that day had ended, and rest must begin. Beds, such as they were not inviting retreats of layered foam and spring. They were practical, makeshift places to lie down. A sack of straw or hay laid upon the compacted dirt floor might serve as a mattress, while those slightly more fortunate could count on a basic wooden frame to lift them from the cold ground. Yet even these modest arrangements bore their burdens, dampness creeping up from the earth, the ever-present risk of lice or mites, and the gradual decay of organic materials that required regular renewal. Blankets were heavy, rough things, woven from wool, stitched from discarded garments, or fashioned from cured hides. They offered only modest protection from the night's chill, yet within the close quarters of a peasant home, warmth came not from the bedding itself but from the bodies gathered together. Privacy, in the way we understand it today, simply did not exist. Parents, children, elders, and sometimes neighbors slept together in tight proximity. The rhythm of sleep was shared, the creak of limbs shifting, the quiet breathing of others, the occasional murmur or sigh, all part of a collective human presence that neither demanded solitude nor found discomfort in its absence. In the colder months, even the animals joined this fragile circle of warmth. A few chickens, a piglet, or a young calf might be brought indoors, not as pets but as companions in survival. Their bodies radiated a quiet, vital heat, their presence offering a few more degrees against the winter's bite. The rustling of feathers, the occasional snort or soft grunt, the earthy scent of fur and straw, these too became part of the night, not as disturbances but as accepted details of life. The line between human and nature blurred within these walls, and in this nightly stillness, one finds not hardship alone, but a quiet kind of endurance, the sort born not of comfort, but of resilience, togetherness, and a deep familiarity with the dark. The first sleep, for the medieval peasant, unfolded as a deep and undisturbed surrender, a descent into heavy slumber shaped not by luxury but by the sheer weight of physical exhaustion. It came swiftly, almost mercifully, after long hours spent under the open sky, tilling stubborn soil, hauling heavy buckets of water, grinding coarse grain into flour, or spinning thread beneath flickering candlelight. These were not leisurely tasks but unrelenting necessities, each day a test of endurance. And so, when night finally enveloped the village and the body found stillness, it wasted no time in slipping into a state of genuine rest. This was not light or fragmented sleep, but a profound and necessary unconsciousness, one that allowed the muscles to repair, the mind to retreat, and the spirit to recover. Yet, as the hours passed, sometime around midnight or perhaps later, in the deeper part of night, a gentle shift would begin. Not sudden or jarring. There were no alarms, no bright lights, no disruption. Instead, it was a natural stirring, a slow and quiet emergence from the depths of slumber. The body, as if following some ancient rhythm etched into its very being, would gradually rise to a state of calm wakefulness. There was no panic in this, no frustration or sense of something lost. It was simply how night unfolded. This marked the beginning of what was once called the middle of the night, a liminal space that could stretch from an hour to 3 or more, depending on the season, the person, and the needs of the household. This interlude between first and second sleep was not met with annoyance or anxiety as we might experience with modern restlessness. Rather, it was embraced as a natural part of life's rhythm, an opportunity gently carved out by the silence and stillness that only true night can offer. During this time, the central hearth, the beating heart of the home, might be stirred to life once more. A few embers coaxed into flame, casting soft light upon wooden beams and earthen walls. Shadows would stretch and flicker, the warm orange glow creating a fragile oasis within the surrounding darkness. This quiet moment became a kind of sanctuary, both physical and spiritual. For many, this waking interval held sacred meaning. In a time when faith was not a part of life but its foundation, the silence of the night was seen as an open doorway to the divine. With the distractions of labor and noise behind them, men and women alike might turn inward, offering whispered prayers, reflecting on scripture committed to memory, or simply speaking, softly, honestly, to God, to saints, or to the unseen forces they believed shaped their world. There were no formal rituals here, only a deep, personal quietude. In the company of glowing embers and the steady rhythm of breath, it became a time not of waiting for sleep's return, but of presence, a brief, peaceful intermission in the long song of night. Beyond the spiritual, this quiet pocket of the night served as an unexpectedly productive window, a time when the body, though not in motion, could still offer its hands to the rhythms of domestic life. With the world outside cloaked in stillness, the tasks within the home took on a different tone, less hurried, more mindful. A woman might settle herself near the fire's gentle glow, fingers moving deftly as she spun flax or wool into thread. The soft, rhythmic whir of the spindle became the only sound, a kind of lullaby for the night itself. Nearby, a man might carefully draw a whetstone across the blade of a scythe, the faint rasp of metal against stone a quiet echo of diligence. These were not labors of urgency but of care, tasks done with patience, under the gentle hush of flickering shadows. In some homes, dough for the next day's bread might be needed in these hours, the familiar give of the dough beneath calloused palms offering a grounding comfort. For new mothers, the middle of the night could be a time of deep connection, a peaceful, undisturbed space to nurse their infants, to cradle them in the intimate hush, away from the bustle and noise of the day. In those moments, the bond between mother and child was nourished not only by milk but by the presence of stillness, of warmth, of quiet time shared alone. Even the mending of clothes, the tightening of bindings, the careful checking of tools, small acts of maintenance, found their place in this slow, in-between time, ensuring that the family would rise to a world just a little more prepared. But the significance of this nocturnal interlude extended further, into the emotional and social fabric of the home. In a world where daylight was crowded and privacy a rare and fleeting thing, these hours allowed space for softer, more personal moments. With most of the household asleep and the village silent, spouses might turn toward one another for quiet conversation. There, in whispered tones, beyond the reach of curious ears, they shared the weight of their days, their thoughts, their worries, their hopes. It was a time for comfort, for touch, for the kind of intimacy that required no grand gestures, only presence. Sometimes, stories were told, old tales passed down from parents and grandparents, folk wisdom, cautionary legends, or playful memories shared in hushed voices. These weren't performances, but acts of remembrance, preserving identity, history, and kinship through language. And in some places, if neighbors lived just beyond the wall or a short walk away, they too might take part in this quiet ritual. A shared cup of ale by a low fire, a few soft-spoken words exchanged across the threshold, not for necessity, but for the simple comfort of knowing one was not alone in the dark. In this way, the middle of the night became more than just a pause between sleeps. It was a time of gentle productivity, quiet communion, and reaffirmed connection. A forgotten rhythm of life that unfolded not in the glare of day, but in the hidden hours when time seemed to slow, and the world, for a little while, became still. And then, there was the sensory landscape of the medieval night, a world profoundly alive in its quietude, woven from details that modern life has largely silenced or sterilized. The sounds were soft but ever-present, the steady, rhythmic breathing of those asleep, bodies close together under rough woolen blankets, the occasional creak of timber as someone shifted upon straw, the subtle crackle of the banked hearth fire, its gentle pops sending flickers of warmth and shadow dancing across the walls. Outside, if one listened, there might be the distant hoot of an owl echoing across the fields, or the faint breeze rustling through thatch and trees. Closer still, within the walls, the delicate scuttle of a mouse across the rafters or the soft snort of a piglet nestled near the hearth added to the texture of the night. These were not disruptions, but familiar companions, reminders of life continuing quietly in the darkness. And the smells, vivid and grounding, painted their own portrait. There was the unmistakable earthiness of packed dirt floors, the faint metallic scent of the fireplace soot, and the lingering smoke that clung to clothes and hair. The warmth of bodies, unwashed yet familiar, mingled with the scent of wool and leather, of straw bedding dampened by breath and time. In some homes, where dough had been prepared in the stillness of the night, the faint aroma of rising bread might drift through the air, carrying with it a sense of comfort and anticipation. It was a tapestry of sensory experience, rich, raw, and undeniably human. In contrast to the filtered air and hum of machines that fill our nights today, this was a world closer to nature, grounded in the tangible presence of life. The segmented sleep pattern itself, something that might seem strange to us now, was born from necessity, not design. It was the natural result of living in a world untouched by artificial illumination. Without electric lights to extend the day, or even an abundance of candles to push back the dark, the night truly was long, deep, and vast. Once the sun dipped below the horizon, there was little else to be done. Reading, crafting, and gathering all became impractical. And so, people slept, not out of laziness, but because the dark offered no invitation to wakefulness. Yet after several hours of deep, restorative slumber, when the body had recovered from the demands of the day, it made perfect sense to wake. This wakefulness, arriving not with jolt or alarm but with quiet readiness, provided a welcome break in the long stretch of night. It allowed for a return to reflection, for quiet tasks, for whispered connection. Then, when the fire had dimmed again and the darkness deepened once more, they would return naturally to sleep, lighter this time, perhaps more dream-filled, until the cool breath of dawn began to stir and the sky hinted at day. Indeed, a growing number of sleep historians and scientists now suggest that this segmented pattern of rest, once so common and intuitive, may actually represent a more natural, even optimal, biphasic rhythm for human beings. Rather than an anomaly of the past, it may be the original design, one that flourished across countless cultures for thousands of years before artificial lighting and the rigid demands of industrialization reshaped our relationship with time. In this light, the modern insistence on securing an unbroken 8-hour block of sleep, often chased with anxiety and medicated persistence, begins to appear not as a biological necessity, but as a cultural artifact. For the medieval peasant, sleep was not a nightly battle to be won. It was a rhythm they surrendered to without resistance, in harmony with their bodies, their environment, and the greater pulse of the natural world. Their waking hours were shaped not by clocks, but by the sun's slow, steady arc across the sky. From the first glimmer of light to its last golden flare, their lives moved in accordance with the day's possibilities and the seasonal rhythm of the land. Early to bed, early to rise, was not a slogan or aspiration. It was simply life, an unspoken rule dictated by necessity and the turning of the earth. During the long summer months, the days stretched wide with labor, fields to tend, animals to care for, and crops to nurture. But in winter, the balance shifted. The days grew short, and with the light's retreat came fewer hours for outdoor work. The cold pressed in through walls and windows, encouraging families to huddle indoors, wrapped in blankets and quiet activity. In these darker months, sleep itself often became elongated, not in a single stretch, but spread gently over the lengthy nights, reflecting a kind of seasonal adaptation, almost a human form of hibernation. This slower winter rhythm allowed for rest not just as recovery, but as preservation. With fewer demands and more hours of darkness, bodies could conserve energy. Fires burned low, movement slowed, and sleep extended its reach into the fabric of daily life. And always, sleep was functional, a vital force directly tied to one's ability to endure. It replenished strength for the relentless tasks ahead, turning soil with crude tools, drawing water from frozen wells, chopping wood, mending fences, nursing livestock. Every moment of rest was an investment in survival. For these peasants, sleep was not optional, nor was it romanticized. It was elemental, as essential as bread or fire. It offered no escape from hardship, but it made hardship bearable. Their nights, broken into phases and woven with moments of prayer, work, care, and companionship, were not imperfect. They were simply human, closer, perhaps, to the rhythm our bodies still remember, even if the world we inhabit no longer allows it. Now, let us drift further into the quietude of these midnight hours, the still, contemplative stretch between the two halves of sleep. In this fragile window of wakefulness, the medieval peasant, no longer bound by the immediate demands of survival or conversation, would have found their mind unmoored from the weight of daily toil. Freed from the relentless physicality of labor and the unceasing noise of communal life, their thoughts could stretch inward. Without written journals, glowing screens, or books to distract or direct the mind, the internal world, memory, imagination, reflection, became the most fertile ground for wandering. What were their dreams like, fragmented by the rhythm of biphasic sleep and perhaps remembered with startling clarity in the stillness between? Did visions of abundance or omens of scarcity slip into their rest, echoing their ever-present concerns? Perhaps they carried dreams of fields golden with grain, or nightmares of blight and famine. It is easy to imagine that their minds returned again and again to the same worries: the uncertainty of the next harvest, the quiet dread of illness spreading through family or flock, the burdensome demands of a feudal lord whose shadow loomed over every yield and tax. But alongside these weights, there may also have been lighter reflections: a memory of shared laughter at the market, the scent of bread baking, the satisfaction of a mended tool, or the quiet pride in a day's honest work completed. In this dark hush, with movement stilled and firelight dwindling to gentle embers, the visual world faded. Shadows receded into blackness, and with sight subdued, the other senses gently rose. The ears took in more than they might during the day: the sigh of wind threading through the cracks in the wall, the distant howl or rustle from the wild beyond, unsettling yet familiar, a constant reminder of the thin, fragile boundary between their warm domestic cocoon and the vast, untamed wilderness just outside. They might feel the comforting weight of a woolen blanket, the shared warmth of a sleeping child or spouse nearby, the rough grain of wood beneath their palm. In such moments, even intuition may have felt heightened, a sixth sense sharpened by generations of living closely with the land, the weather, the cycle of life and death. This was, in many ways, the only time a peasant truly had to be alone with themselves, not physically, but inwardly. The hours were quiet not just in sound, but in expectation. No one asked anything of them then. The world did not intrude. In that rare stillness, the inner life was allowed to surface, not as indulgence, but as necessity, a space for the soul to breathe, a place where, in the soft darkness, humanity found itself, not in grandeur or invention, but in the small, enduring act of simply being awake in the night. The sheer cost of light in the medieval world cannot be overstated. What we now take for granted, the simple flick of a switch to banish darkness, was once an unattainable luxury for most. Candles, when available, were precious commodities. The more affordable ones, made from tallow rendered from animal fat, burned with a dim, smoky flame and an acrid scent. Beeswax candles, with their cleaner burn and steadier light, were often reserved for churches, nobility, or significant occasions, their value so high they were sometimes stored like treasure. Oil lamps, too, were a costly indulgence, requiring imported oils or carefully rendered animal fats. For the average peasant, whose resources were meager and carefully rationed, lighting a candle after dusk was not a decision made lightly. To burn light unnecessarily was to consume what might otherwise be traded, eaten, or repurposed for survival. This economic reality meant that nightfall was not simply a shift in the natural world. It was a profound change in their lived environment. Darkness was not optional. It was expected, habitual, and enforced by necessity. When the sun disappeared, so too did most activities. The hearth's glow offered the only consistent source of illumination, and even that was tended with care, its embers stretched to last through the night. Without ambient light to prolong the day, the passage into rest was not a personal choice but a societal rhythm. It shaped when people worked, when they rested, and how they divided the night. Thus, segmented sleep was not just a reflection of biology, though it harmonized beautifully with the body's natural inclinations, but also a direct response to material conditions. The deep silence and darkness of night were not merely environmental features. but structural limitations woven into daily life. They made rest not just a matter of health, but one of necessity and conservation. In this way, the medieval peasant's sleep was both deeply human and utterly pragmatic, a rhythm born of survival, scarcity, and a quiet, unspoken alignment with the boundaries of their world. Furthermore, consider the deeply communal nature of their sleeping arrangements, a reality far removed from our modern ideals of personal space and privacy. Not only would nuclear families sleep side by side, but often extended kin, visiting relatives, live-in farmhands, or household servants would share the same room and, in many cases, the same bedding space. Walls, if present at all, did not divide bedrooms. They enclosed the entire household in a single, shared breath. This constant physical proximity dissolved the modern notion of solitude. Personal boundaries, as we understand them today, were virtually non-existent. Life was lived together, fully, continuously, even in sleep. In this closeness, their existence became deeply interwoven. The warmth of another body was not just comfort but necessity, especially in the bitter depths of winter. The rise and fall of breath from nearby chests became a quiet rhythm of reassurance, the presence of others anchoring each sleeper within the safety of the group. It was a form of intimacy that went beyond affection, a quiet, embodied trust. One's sleep was protected not by locks or doors, but by the nearness of others. A shared blanket was a shared defense against the cold. A whisper in the night might be a warning or a lullaby. Of course, this closeness brought risk. Illness could move quickly through such households, passed from one bedmate to the next with ease. Yet this same closeness cultivated something far more enduring, a deep, mutual reliance. In a world defined by hardship and uncertainty, connection was not a luxury but a lifeline. Community was not forged only in daylight labor but sustained in the night, in shared rest, in synchronized slumber, in the quiet vulnerability of laying oneself down among others. The human body was never truly alone. It was always aware of others beside it, around it, breathing the same cold air, listening to the same distant wind, dreaming beneath the same thatched roof. In such a world, the individual was not the center, the collective was. The self existed within the context of others, and even sleep, the most private of human acts, was shaped by the presence of the group. It was a life rooted not in isolation, but in togetherness. And in the dark, cold silence of medieval nights, that togetherness was everything. And while we today often lament our modern struggles with sleep, the tossing and turning, the racing thoughts, the glow of screens delaying rest, it's worth considering that the medieval peasant, living within what we might now call a fragmented or irregular pattern, may have experienced a sleep of a profoundly different kind. Though their lives were filled with hardship, their relationship to rest was not adversarial. There were no prescriptions for insomnia, no blue light filters or sleep apps. Instead, their sleep followed the shape of the earth itself. It rose and fell with the sun, waxed and waned with the seasons, and unfolded gently in harmony with the natural world around them. Their bodies, conditioned by honest exhaustion and the absence of artificial stimulation, yielded easily to slumber. And when they woke, not abruptly but gradually, often communally, it was without resentment. The rhythm of first sleep, midnight waking, and second sleep was not a problem to be solved, but a way of being. Their rest may have been humble and imperfect by our standards, but it was deeply resonant, not carved out against the grain of nature, but carried along with it. Sleep, for them, was not a daily struggle or a quest for optimization. It was a quiet ritual embedded in the fabric of life. A surrender, not to convenience, but to rhythm, to the fire's last glow, to the hush of a resting household, to the slow, steady breathing of others nearby. In their darkness, shaped by limitation and necessity, perhaps there was also a kind of peace, one that whispered through the rafters and wrapped itself around them like a blanket, reminding them that rest is not something to earn, but something to return to, again and again, in step with the turning of the world. In today's world, where time is compartmentalized and every moment pressured by productivity, sleep has become another task to manage, a checkbox in the self-optimization routine. We track it with devices, analyze it through data, and often grow frustrated when it doesn't conform to our expectations. But perhaps what we've lost is not just duration or quality, but relationship, our relationship with the night itself. The medieval peasant, for all the hardship of their existence, lived in partnership with the darkness. Night was not something to fight or escape, but something to move through with patience and rhythm. It enveloped them not with anxiety, but with inevitability. Their sleep was marked not by isolation but by presence, the presence of others, of nature, of a slower pace. In our endless pursuit of privacy and silence, we may have also lost something essential, the deep comfort of shared stillness, of knowing others are near, breathing the same air, resting under the same roof. The communal sleep of the past, though born of necessity, offered a sense of belonging rarely found in our single-occupancy rooms and soundproofed walls. It was not perfect, it was not clean, but it was whole. There is, perhaps, wisdom in their forgotten rhythm, not in romanticizing poverty or discomfort, but in recognizing that our biology has not changed, only our context has. The urge to wake in the night, the restlessness that visits us at 2 a.m., may not be dysfunction but memory, an echo of a time when such awakenings were not feared but welcomed. We try to force sleep into straight lines. They let it bend and breathe. And so, in remembering their nights, we are invited to reconsider our own, to dim the lights a little earlier, to welcome the quiet, to see wakefulness not as failure, but as space, for reflection, for stillness, for simply being. The medieval peasant lived by the rhythms of firelight, breath, and shadow. And in that darkness, perhaps, they found something we still yearn for, not just rest, but peace. To walk through a medieval village at night, if such a thing were possible, would be to step into a world where quiet did not mean emptiness, but depth. It would not be the sterile hush of double-paned windows and distant highways, nor the artificial stillness created by humming machines and noise-canceling walls. No, this quiet would be alive. Every breath of wind would carry with it the rustle of thatched roofs and the soft rattle of wooden shutters. Floorboards, worn and uneven, might creak beneath the shifting weight of sleepers. Somewhere, a dog would turn in its straw bedding, letting out a low sigh as it settled again. Through cracks in cottage walls, the scent of packed earth and drying herbs would drift into the air, mingling with the ever-present traces of ash and wood smoke. Nothing here would be sharp or electric. Time would not press forward in steady ticks, but drift like smoke, slow, thick, and inevitable. The darkness itself would feel complete. Without gas lamps, without electric bulbs, the night would not be broken or diluted, it would be whole. It would press in from the edges of the village, encircling it like a soft, heavy cloak. Shapes would blur. Shadows would lengthen. The only light would come from the occasional flicker behind a window, the last glow of a hearth, the wavering flame of a single candle, carefully rationed. The world would narrow to what could be heard, smelled, felt. The eye would no longer lead. The body would begin to listen more closely. And in this darkness, strangely, one might feel more connected to the home, to the land, to the invisible breath of the village moving through the hours. It would be a kind of quiet that holds you, not isolating, but enveloping. For a child, this night would have felt vast and full of wonder. Swaddled in coarse wool blankets, lying close to siblings or parents, they would listen, not to music or machines, but to stories. Stories told in low, deliberate voices, shaped by candlelight and memory. There were tales of saints and sinners, of creatures in the forest who crept only after dusk, of spirits who whispered to those who dared to leave the house after nightfall. But not all stories were meant to frighten. Some were tales of kindness, of miracles, of ancestors long gone who watched over them still. In that softened state between waking and sleep, with the day's chores behind and tomorrow still far away, the stories seemed to stretch, growing taller, deeper, more true. This was not simply entertainment. It was identity. It was how a child came to know where they belonged. The stories spoken at night were often the same ones heard years before, and the same ones that would be told again years later when the children had grown. They were fluid, adapting with the teller, shaped by the weather, the season, the room's mood. But the essence remained. They reminded listeners who they were. They taught values. They carried warnings. They kept alive the shared memory of a people who owned no books, who etched their understanding of the world into voice and repetition. A child might not remember the details the next morning, but something would remain, a phrase, a name, a mood, woven quietly into their dreams. In a world where life was uncertain, where winters were long and losses common, this oral tradition provided continuity. The village might change. People might pass. But the stories endured. And so the night was never just a time for sleep. It was a time for soft magic. For the merging of day's end with ancestral memory. For the lowering of voices and the lifting of imagination. In the darkness, there was room for things that did not fit into the brightness of day. For faith, for fear, for wonder, for wisdom. The medieval night may seem harsh from where we stand now, but to those who lived it, it offered a kind of belonging that we, in our separate rooms and shuttered silences, rarely find. It was a time of surrender, not just of body to sleep, but of self to story, to stillness, to the shared breath of an entire village drifting gently through the dark together. And in this darkness, where the line between the natural and the supernatural often blurred, people's inner lives grew vivid. Dreams were not dismissed or forgotten. They were noticed, sometimes feared, sometimes cherished, sometimes interpreted as messages. A strange dream in the night might be mentioned over bread the next morning, weighed with quiet seriousness. In the absence of constant distraction, the mind reached inward, grasping for meaning in symbols and silence. The night was not merely absence, it was a realm of wonder, of questions too fragile to be asked in daylight. Religious belief infused the hours as much as it did every other aspect of their lives. Many believed the devil walked more freely in the night, and that prayer was strongest in darkness. Midnight hours were thought to carry a thin veil between this world and the next, a time for sacred words, for protection, for the murmured repetition of psalms. Monasteries rang bells in the night for vigils, calling monks from sleep into candlelit chapels to offer praise while the world slumbered. Even for lay people, the darkness was never fully empty. It was filled with presence, of God, of spirits, of the mysteries of creation. As the hours wore on and the embers of the fire grew faint, the household would settle once more. Blankets drawn tighter, limbs curling instinctively toward warmth, the body would slip again into its second sleep, lighter, perhaps more dream-filled, yet no less essential. Outside, the sky would begin to pale, the stars retreating into the quiet hush of dawn. Roosters would stir. Frost might glisten on the thatch. And slowly, without fanfare, the village would rise. Morning in the medieval world did not arrive with urgency. It crept in gently, like mist over the fields, slowly replacing the dark with pale light that slipped through cracks in shutters and the gaps between roof beams. There were no alarms to jolt one awake, no sudden flood of noise, no crowd of messages awaiting attention. The village stirred gradually. One might rise not because the clock demanded it, but because the body, attuned to the cold and the shift in light, felt it was time. The rhythm of waking belonged not to the individual, but to the household, to the animals, to the sky itself. It was not something to fight against, it was something to join, The day began not with noise or haste, but with simple, grounding rituals. The first to wake would tend to the hearth, coaxing warmth back from its dying embers. It was an act done quietly, with care, not only to restore heat, but to relight the heart of the home. The drawing of water followed, often from a nearby stream or communal well, the bucket clanking gently against stone. The cold bit at fingers and faces, but no one complained. These were the inherited gestures of mourning, done not for novelty, but for need. And as the first pieces of bread were broken and warmed, they were not consumed thoughtlessly, but often blessed, touched briefly by gratitude before becoming sustenance. Though labor awaited, and it was often long, physical, and unyielding, there was no manic rush to meet it. The chores came steadily, feeding animals, tending the fire, sweeping the earthen floor. Life moved forward with purpose, but not panic. The pace was not set by appointments or traffic, but by daylight, by weather, by the shared understanding of what must be done. Time was not something that pressed down from above, but something that grew outward from the center, the hearth, the family, the fields. The land did not shout its demands. It whispered them, and people listened. This lack of morning frenzy did not mean life was easy. Far from it. The demands of survival were constant, especially for those who tilled the soil or cared for livestock. But there was a kind of dignity in the way the day was entered, a slowness that allowed the soul to follow the body, a rhythm that honored the transition from night to day as something meaningful. The night was not a break from real life. It was part of it. Rest and labor, silence and sound, dark and light, each balanced the other, each gave shape to the whole. And so, when the medieval peasant began their day, it was not as a machine turning on, but as a human being rejoining the unfolding world. The light had returned. The coals were glowing again. The first steps of the day were quiet but sure. The night, with all its rest and reflection, had not been wasted. It had prepared them. And now, with breath visible in the cool air and the sky slowly brightening overhead, life began again. Not with alarm, but with intention. Not with speed, but with steadiness. The sacred rhythm of existence continued, one humble morning at a time. And so, when we look back at the sleep of our ancestors, it is not merely a glimpse into an old routine. It is a window into a different way of being, slower, darker, yet perhaps more attuned to the human spirit. Their nights remind us that sleep was once not an inconvenience or a deficit, but a companion to life, a return each evening to silence, to breath, to the shared rhythms of the earth. To live in such alignment with the rhythms of nature was not a choice for the medieval peasant. It was a condition of existence. And yet, within that condition, a quiet grace unfolded. In surrendering to the boundaries of light and dark, warmth and cold, season and soil, they cultivated a life where the pace of the body and the turning of the world were not at odds. Their sleep, fragmented, communal, and unhurried, was just one thread in a broader tapestry of balance. They rose with the sun not to optimize their output, but because the light had returned. They slept when darkness made work impossible, and in that constraint, they found not suffering but rhythm. Today, we are unshackled from those natural limits. Artificial light floods every corner of our homes and lives. Night no longer holds us. We stretch the day endlessly, pushing our minds and bodies far beyond what they were ever asked to endure. We treat sleep not as a sanctuary but as an inconvenience, something to delay, to medicate, to negotiate. And yet, in this freedom, something essential has been lost. The deep rest that comes not from blackout curtains and noise machines, but from harmony with one's body, with one's home, with the slow breathing of the earth itself. There is wisdom in remembering, not to replicate the hardship of their lives, but to reclaim something of their slowness, their surrender, their trust in the cycles that govern all living things. Perhaps we cannot return to a world without electric light or modern responsibility, But we can choose, in small ways, to honor what the night was once meant to be. We can embrace the waking hour between sleeps, not with frustration, but with curiosity. We can speak softly, move slowly, dim the lights. We can rest not just to recover, but to reconnect. In doing so, we may find that rest becomes less elusive. That sleep, when not fought for, arrives more freely. That the night, when entered gently, is not something to fear, but to welcome. And that within the silence, the deep, shared silence our ancestors knew so intimately, there is still a place for us. What the medieval night offers us, more than anything, is a mirror, not to a world we should recreate, but to one we should not forget. It shows us that life was once built upon natural constraints, and that within those constraints, there was space for rest, reflection, and connection. The people of that time did not wrestle the night into submission. They moved with it, shaped by it, even comforted by it. And though their world was hard, the night itself was not their enemy. It was at times their only refuge. We often speak of progress as a straight line, each century brighter and faster than the last. But progress, while powerful, can also be disorienting. In gaining the ability to conquer the dark, we may have lost our reverence for it. In severing ourselves from the natural sleep rhythms that governed our ancestors, we've gained more hours, but not necessarily more peace. The ceaseless glow of modernity keeps us ever awake, not just in body, but in mind, crowding out the quiet where stillness once lived. Perhaps there is something to learn from their darkness, something deeper than routine, something spiritual in its quiet discipline. To rise in the middle of the night and tend to small, meaningful tasks. To speak softly to a child. To stir the fire not just for warmth, but for company. To sit with one's thoughts without needing to silence them with noise. In these practices lies a kind of intimacy with the self and with the present moment that modern life too often forgets. And there is beauty, too, in their shared vulnerability. In sleeping shoulder to shoulder with family and farmhands, with infants and animals, the medieval peasant knew the power of closeness. Not always by choice, but always with consequence. To sleep beside another was to accept their warmth, their breath, their dreams. In the quiet hours, they shared not only shelter, but fear, hope, and story. Each night was a small act of community, a surrender not just to sleep, but to each other. We live now in insulated worlds, in silence shaped by insulation and white noise, in rooms with closed doors and drawn curtains. And still, we wake feeling alone. But the peasant, curled on straw beside loved ones, may have known a different kind of rest, not deeper in duration, but deeper in meaning. Their sleep may have been cold, short, and hard, but perhaps it was also, in ways we are only beginning to understand, whole. And so, when the night feels long, or when you find yourself awake in the soft hours between dusk and dawn, remember them. Remember that this, too, is part of the rhythm we once knew. That sleeplessness is not always brokenness. That stillness is not always empty. That the dark, when welcomed, becomes not a void, but a home. And now, as we reach the final edge of this long, quiet journey through the medieval night, let us linger a while longer, not to rush away, but to sit in stillness and consider the depth of what once was. The world we've wandered through was not one of grandeur or spectacle, but one built of rhythm, humility, and breath. A world where night fell completely, where the light died with the sun, and where sleep, unhurried, unbroken by artificial pressure, took its place not as a disruption, but as a sacred passage through darkness. The medieval peasant knew no sleep aids, no curated bedtime routines, no circadian charts. There was no anxiety about blue light, no rituals of lavender sprays or digital detoxes. What they had instead was something quieter, something older, a relationship with night that was neither adversarial nor controlled. They met darkness not with resistance, but with routine. The sun set, and so did the body. The cold came, and so did the need for closeness. The fire dimmed, and so did the voices in the room. No switch was flicked. No line divided waking from sleep. The day simply faded, and life gently faded with it. We imagine ourselves as having advanced far beyond those times. And in many ways we have. Our homes are warm. Our beds are soft. We can travel across continents while they could barely walk beyond the village edge. We possess medicine, comfort, technology, and light. So much light. Light that burns into our midnight, that shapes our schedules and expectations, that lets us work, communicate, scroll endlessly long after night should have taken us in its arms. We call it freedom. And perhaps it is. But freedom comes with forgetting. We have forgotten the gift of slowness, the power of the dark to reset the soul, the strange comfort of waking at midnight with nothing to do but listen, to the wind, to the crackle of ember, to the breathing of others near us. We have forgotten that night does not always need to be efficient, and that rest is not a problem to be solved, but a language to be remembered. The peasant's night was filled with presence, and presence, however plain, is its own richness. The warmth of another body beside you, the subtle shuffling of straw, the whisper of a child asking for a story, the soft murmur of a prayer from someone else in the room. These were their lullabies. The world did not retreat entirely, it simply softened. And within that softness, sleep found its place again and again without needing to be forced. There is something deeply human about this, to sleep not in isolation, but in connection, not in silence that excludes, but in quiet that includes. Sleep as something shared, something seen, something that binds. And within their two-part slumber, those sacred hours between first and second sleep, the world slowed even further. What a strange and beautiful interval that was. A time of wakefulness welcomed without guilt. A time to tend the fire, to mend clothes, to feed a hungry infant, to reflect, to pray. To simply be without needing to explain it. Imagine a moment where being awake in the night wasn't a crisis. It was expected, embraced, held with quiet dignity. It was not broken sleep. It was a different sleep, a different rhythm. How many of us today wake at that same hour and wonder what's wrong with us? We turn over in bed, eyes scanning the ceiling, hearts racing, minds unsettled. We call it insomnia, a disorder, a flaw. But what if it's not? What if it is the echo of something our bodies have not forgotten, something our world has moved past, but our blood still remembers? What if the night still calls to us, not to be filled with noise and motion, but simply to be felt? In that old world, darkness was honest. It allowed things to unfold at their natural pace. It gave space for dreams, for fears, for thoughts too tender for the clamor of day. It gave weight to sleep, not as an obligation, but as a rhythm of being. A pause in the living thread. A descent into quiet mystery. And the mystery of sleep, as the peasants knew it, was deeply intertwined with faith, with nature, with each other. They believed the night was thinner, holier, that angels or demons might pass by, that prayers spoken in darkness held more weight, that dreams meant something, that the still hours were for the soul. And in a way, they were right. Even now, we sense something sacred in the middle of the night, when all is quiet, when no one needs anything, when the world has briefly stopped demanding. What if we honored that time again? Not by returning to straw mattresses or cold hearths, but by reclaiming the rhythm, letting ourselves wake without fear. Sit quietly, think or not think, be or not be. Let the dark hold us for a while, without judgment, without rush, because the night is not broken. Only our relationship to it is. The darkness that once enveloped the village is still there, behind the noise, behind the lights, behind the endless scroll. It waits for us, patiently, just as it always has. It does not ask us to give up comfort or progress, only that we remember, that we listen, that we soften, and maybe in doing so, we'll find sleep again, not the sleep of tracking devices and pharmaceutical promises, but the sleep of old, the sleep of surrender, of slowness, of rhythm, a sleep that knows when to rise, when to rest, and when to wait in stillness, a sleep that is whole. And when we close our eyes, truly close them, may we feel something ancient stir within us. The memory of 1,000 nights spent by firelight, the echo of feet brushing straw, the hush of stories long forgotten, the breath of a loved one beside us, the vast, black sky above, turning slowly toward dawn. The dawn that follows such a night is not rushed. It arrives softly, not in blaring alarms or harsh fluorescence, but in gradual light, the pale blue glow slipping between roof beams, the gentle crow of a rooster far off, the rustle of someone rising to stoke the hearth. In the medieval world, morning was not a race. It was a return, a slow reclaiming of movement, of duty, of voice. But it was never jarring. The body, having already stirred once in the quiet heart of night, welcomed morning not as an interruption, but as the next note in a song that had been playing all along. The new day, though full of labor, did not erase the depth of the night. The memory of dreams lingered, the stories told in whispers still echoed in the corners of the mind. The warmth of bodies slept beside was not easily forgotten. There was no sudden rupture between rest and waking, but rather a continuum, a sense that both states belonged to a larger, unified rhythm of life. In that slow return to wakefulness, there was no shame in having slept long, or woken early, or paused between two sleeps. It was all part of the natural flow. Perhaps this is what we are truly searching for, not just sleep, but restoration. Not just unconsciousness, but connection. A sleep that does not isolate, but gathers. That folds the body into the rhythm of wind and wood smoke and breath. A sleep that does not hide from the dark, but welcomes it. One that does not reject wakefulness at midnight, but receives it gently, like a familiar visitor. A rhythm not measured by apps or averages, but by the quiet satisfaction of a life lived in step with the unseen, unspoken clock of the world. If we could remember this, not in nostalgia, but in reverence, we might reshape our nights. Not entirely, not with candles or thatch, but with intention, with stillness, with care. We might begin to dim the lights earlier, to sit quietly rather than scroll, to wake without panic, and let the night teach us again how to rest, how to reflect, how to simply be. In doing so, we would not be returning to the past, but recovering something timeless, the knowledge that rest, true rest, cannot be forced. It must be welcomed. And in that welcome, there is peace. Not a perfect peace, but a human one. One made of straw and silence, of shared stories and steady breath. One found not in the perfection of conditions, but in the permission to soften, to lay down the weight of the day and let the dark hold us. In remembering the night of the peasant, we remember something of ourselves, something ancient, something quiet, and something that even now waits patiently each evening, behind the noise, behind the light, behind the door, for us to finally come home. And now, as we near the quiet close of this long reflection, we find ourselves not simply standing at the edge of history, but having walked slowly through it, as if we ourselves had wandered barefoot down a dirt path beneath the stars, past shuttered wooden homes, past hearths flickering low behind rough-hewn walls. We have stepped into a world long gone, yet strangely familiar. A world whose pace was not measured in minutes, but in light, whose nights were not filled with the glow of devices or the noise of industry, but with breath, fire, and silence. We began our journey in sleep, or rather, in the forgotten shape of it. Segmented sleep, as it was once known, was not a quirk of culture but a rhythm embedded in the life of every medieval home. A first sleep, deep and restorative, followed by a natural, unhurried waking, not one of frustration or insomnia, but of gentle attention, of inner stillness. And then a second sleep, lighter, dream-filled, drawing the sleeper toward dawn. It was a cycle guided by the darkness itself, not imposed by obligation or social design, but invited by nature. In that in-between time, the soul was allowed to stir. People prayed. They mended. They whispered to one another. They listened to the wind. They existed without needing to rush back to sleep. This was not disordered rest. It was the very opposite. It was ordered by something deeper than the clock. We looked closely, too, at the soundscape and textures of the medieval night, a kind of quiet no longer known to us. Not the sterilized silence of climate-controlled rooms or the dull hum of city air. Their quiet was living, layered, imperfect. It was the creak of timber beneath shifting weight, the far-off hoot of an owl, the whisper of straw as someone turned. It was the nearness of animals, a piglet snuffling softly, a chicken rustling its feathers. It was the scent of wood smoke clinging to skin, the musk of shared bodies beneath wool, the cool breath of the earth itself rising through cracks in the floor. Nothing was filtered. Nothing was muted. Every sensation belonged. In this world, sleep was not solitary. It was shared. Rooms were not divided by walls, and people were not separated by expectation. Entire families, and sometimes extended ones, slept in the same space. The nearness of others was not seen as inconvenience, but as comfort. You heard each other breathing. You felt the warmth of their bodies through the night. You bore witness to each other's dreams, each other's sickness, each other's sighs. There was no pretending to be self-contained. The individual existed always within the fabric of the group, always woven into something larger. Vulnerability was not hidden, but acknowledged, even embraced. And in those dark hours, stories came alive. Told in the soft lull between the crackling of embers and the return of slumber, these tales carried the weight of history, morality, belief. They were how children learned who they were. They were how memory was passed from one voice to another, not ink on parchment, but breath into air. This oral tradition thrived in the quiet, unlit spaces of the world, where imagination had room to stretch and where the line between the visible and invisible felt thin. To a child, the night was not just sleep. It was magic and mystery and meaning. When morning came, it did not crash into the world. There were no alarms, no screens, no urgent to-do lists blinking awake. The light crept in softly, spilling across uneven floors, kissing the lids of still sleeping eyes. Someone rose first, usually without a word, to tend the fire, to draw water, to stir dough. Morning was not a jolt but a return, to motion, to necessity, to community. Life began again, not because the clock demanded it, but because the sun had returned. Time flowed, not forward in bursts, but outward in ripples. And every day was framed on either end by dark, not erased, but held. Yes, their world was harsh. Disease, labor, cold, scarcity, these were constants. But in that hardship lived a rhythm we no longer recognize. A cadence we've traded for control. A slowness we've replaced with speed. The medieval peasant did not master sleep. They accepted it. They moved with it. They made room for it. And in doing so, perhaps they knew something that we, in all our electric brilliance, have forgotten. Today, we speak of sleep as if it is a transaction, as if it is something to optimize, to conquer, to fix. We chart our REM cycles. We count our hours. We worry endlessly when it does not come easily. But what if the sleep we long for is not found in perfection, but in surrender? What if our restlessness at 2 a.m. is not failure, but the body remembering? What if the darkness still longs to hold us, if only we would let it? Let us remember, Then, the way it once was, not with longing to return to hardship, but with reverence for the wisdom that hardship shaped. Let us recall the warmth of others sleeping close, the hush between stories, the moment when the fire was the only light left in the world. Let us remember mornings that began with ritual, not alarm, days that moved with the sun, nights that made room for prayer, for thought, for slowness, for dreams. Let us remember that we are not so far removed from them as we imagine. Their rhythm still lingers beneath our noise. So, as we gently pull back from this fascinating glimpse into their nights, let us not merely view their sleep habits as weird, but as profoundly meaningful. They speak to a life lived in exquisite, intimate harmony with the natural world, a connection we have largely severed in our brightly lit, perpetually busy lives. The medieval peasants' ability to adapt and thrive amidst harsh conditions, their deep reliance on communal living, and their quiet acceptance of the night's unique gifts, reveal a resilience and wisdom that transcends the centuries. Their nocturnal wakefulness might have fostered a richer inner life, moments of quiet contemplation, a space for dreams and reflection that our constantly stimulated brains rarely afford us. The shared vulnerability of sleeping in a single room, huddled together against the cold and the unknown, forged deep, unspoken bonds of community. Their sleep wasn't just a physical necessity, it was a deeply integrated component of their entire existence, a cycle that reinforced their connection to the earth, to their faith, and to each other. And with that thought, we gently close our tale, leaving them to their peaceful, ancient slumbers, a quiet testament to a way of life deeply connected to the earth's turning, a rhythm almost lost to time, but one that perhaps still echoes faintly within the deepest corners of our own sleep. Thank you for joining to PlotFall. Until next time, good night.